We have prisons to keep real-life villains at bay, but no system is unbreachable, and sometimes the nightmares slip through the cracks. Join us on our Jail Marathon, a compilation of some of the craziest prison escape stories ever. From intricate plans of escape to lucky twists of fate, these stories have all the ingredients to leave you speechless. Think some of these sound impossible? Guess again. Welcome to Jail. It was morning on August 9, 2005, and the court hearing had just come to an end. Jennifer Forsyth Hyatte was ready to act. It was now or never. She either did it or not. But the woman knew not taking this chance wasn't really an option. She wanted to free George, her husband, and finally get to live the life she deserved. Jennifer was so sick of living for others, and it was high time she lived for herself. At 31 years old, the woman had already been married twice before she met George Hyatte. Jennifer had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and a long and messy list of relationships. As she sat in her blue Ford Explorer, watching the column portico of the Roane County Courthouse in Kingston, Tennessee, Jennifer knew there was nothing that she wouldn't do for George. Her gun was at the ready, the engine was running, and her heart wanted only one thing: to spare her husband a life in prison, away from her, away from freedom. A month before, the woman called her father, who was a former police officer, trying to convince him to give her a handcuff key. When the man refused, Jennifer devised another plan. Jennifer never had it easy, so she had to learn to be resourceful. Her first memory was of her parents' divorce. By the time she turned 15, Jennifer was no longer the little girl who loved horses. She was now someone who loved alcohol and drugs, someone whom older men saw as fair game. The summer before her senior year of high school, Jennifer met someone. When he asked her the big question, Jennifer said yes. The couple had 3 children, but children aren't enough to mend something that's inherently wrong, dangerous, and broken. Their marriage was filled with arguments, drug abuse, and heavy drinking. It didn't last. After another failed marriage and a few more affairs, Jennifer decided to turn her life around, so she took her kids and moved to Tennessee. In early 2004, Jennifer earned a diploma as a licensed practical nurse and took a nursing job at the Northwest Correctional Complex in Tiptonville, Tennessee. That's where she met him. Sure, she had had plenty of affairs, but George Hyatte was different. Jennifer had known it the very instant their eyes had locked for the first time. He was her soulmate, the perfect half, the one thing she had been missing all these years. The two of them fell in love, but not everybody was a fan of this lovesick behavior. 5 months after getting the job and meeting George Hyatte, Jennifer was fired after sneaking food into the prison for him. People couldn't understand why on earth a seemingly respectable woman with a good job would risk it all for a prisoner like George Hyatte. While Jennifer Hyatte stayed put in the car waiting, George Hyatte was pleading guilty to a robbery charge in the courthouse. But then the courthouse hearing was over, and it was time to act. Jennifer was ready, her eyes glued to the building's entrance. And then she saw George, her beloved husband, descending the few steps between him and the van that was going to take him back to prison, away from her love. In 2005, George Hyatte was a 34-year-old and serving a 35-year sentence for aggravated robbery and aggravated assault. His flirting with criminal life started when he was only a child, and at 17, Hyatte started racking up charges for burglary, theft, armed robbery, and striking an officer. By the time he was 21, he was already a repeated offender with a known tendency towards violence. But the man was also a smooth talker and a bit of a ladies' man. In November 2004, Jennifer and George applied for permission to marry. They were wed on May 20th, 2005. Now, a few months later, on August 9th, 2005, George was shackled and flanked by 2 guards, making his way toward the prison van. Jennifer didn't see the guards as 2 living, breathing people. Instead, she saw them as 2 obstacles preventing her happiness. She pulled up to the Tennessee Department of Correction transport van, and then she jumped out of the blue Ford Explorer, holding her gun firmly in her hand. Her husband George was stunned to see her, but he had put 2 and 2 together quickly and started encouraging her straight away. "Shoot him!" George Hyatte yelled out. One of the guards, 56-year-old Wayne Cotton Morgan, grabbed his own gun, but it was no use. Jennifer Hyatte shot him 3 times in the abdomen. The man fell to the ground. He was dead. The other guard managed to shoot Jennifer, but in the meantime, George had made it to the car. The couple sped away before they could be apprehended. Jennifer drove despite her injury. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was the ecstatic feeling of being close to her husband, but she knew she couldn't stop for any reason. They were so close. Way too close to risk destroying everything she'd worked for only because of a small gunshot wound. She drove the Ford to a nearby Subway sandwich shop. The couple then abandoned the car and got into a golden Chevrolet minivan Jennifer had stolen from one of her patients in Hendersonville, Tennessee. They drove away and only stopped 4 hours later at a Lowe's in Florence, Kentucky. They needed a hacksaw to free George Hyatte from the burdensome shackles. The couple then rented a room in a motel about a mile away. They spent the night there, finally together. Finally free. Jennifer Hyatte took antibiotics and pain meds in order to cope with her gunshot wound. But once morning came, the couple knew they had to move again. They were still too close for comfort, too exposed. They were in danger. In the meantime, Jennifer dyed her brown locks black. They took a cab ride to Columbus, Ohio. At the start of the journey, they handed a cab driver 2 $100 bills and started pleading with him. They wanted the man to book them a room in a hotel under his name. But Mike Wagers, the driver, was suspicious about the two. The pair told him they were headed to an Amway convention, which further deepened his suspicions. In Wagers' experience, Amway representatives loved talking about the MLM company they worked for, but these two were really quiet. Still, he dropped them off at the destination. The couple checked into America's Best Value Inn in Columbus, Ohio. They were at ease, smoking Marlboros and munching on snacks and Mexican foods, but their happiness was about to turn sour. Once Mike Wagers got home in Kentucky, he started playing video games. As he was playing, a friend of his told him about the fugitives and the fact that the police had just found an abandoned golden Chevrolet minivan. That's when something clicked for Wagers. He called the police straight away, tipping them about the couple's location. The Hyattes were in their room when the phone rang. Jennifer picked it up and was met with the voice of U.S. Marshal Nikki Ralston. Ralston told Jennifer to get her husband, George, exit the hotel room, and follow the directions of the officers, who would be to their immediate right. They were surrounded. It was the evening of August 10th, 2005. Once the couple got out of their room, Jennifer started pleading with the officers. She asked them not to hurt her husband. "Baby, baby, it'll be okay. It'll be okay," she kept hollering at George Hyatte. Both of them were immediately taken to jail. Jennifer Hyatte pleaded guilty to first-degree murder on September 17, 2007. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She is currently serving her sentence at the Tennessee Prison for Women in Nashville. While in her initial cell in Ohio, Jennifer wrote several letters, but all of them were confiscated. She called those 2 days on the run with her husband the best of her life. George Hyatte pleaded guilty to all charges on March 9, 2009. He also pleaded guilty to first-degree murder of the guard Wayne Cotton Morgan. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. It was the 4th of August, 2008, and things were about to change for a certain inmate at Rockville Correctional Facility. 29-year-old Sarah Jo Pender had had enough of her imprisonment. She was ready to get out and start all over again, away from the bloody past, the messy trials, the countless appeals to have the evidence reassessed, away from anyone she knew and everyone who knew her. It was Sarah's point of view that she had already spent enough time behind bars. Sure, the world called her a murderer, a female Charles Manson, but she never strayed away from her version of the events. She was innocent, or at least almost innocent, but there wasn't and never had been any blood on her hands. Sarah Pender was 21 years old in 2000. Pender was a Purdue University dropout. She worked as a secretary. Her dreams of working in a particle accelerator lab or pursuing a career in biochemistry long gone, or at least put on hold. Her life was quite good as it was, especially since she'd met Richard Hull, who worked as a bouncer at a bar. The two of them had quickly fallen in love and moved in together. Pender and Hull shared their apartment with another couple, Andrew Cataldi, 24, and Tricia Nordman, 25. At 21, Pender was already a far cry from the ambitious student she'd once been. Her boyfriend, Richard Hull, had a criminal history that included 6 misdemeanors and 2 felony convictions for auto theft and residential entry. Her roommates, Cataldi and Nordman, were both fugitives with a background in drug dealing and forgery. And Sarah Pender knew her boyfriend Hull and Andrew Cataldi sold drugs from their place, but she didn't really mind. Things were going great, until they weren't. Richard Hull and Andrew Cataldi had a falling out, presumably because Cataldi had failed to include Hull in one of his drug deals. Hull had enough. Because he could not legally purchase firearms due to his criminal record, he allegedly persuaded Sarah Pender to purchase a weapon for him. On the morning of October 24, 2000, Hall and Pender drove to a local hypermarket where Sarah Pender paid for a shotgun and ammunition. What happened next is anybody's guess, despite the fact it all took place 23 years ago. Here's the official version. Richard Hall and Sarah Pender returned home around 11 p.m. that night. Pender headed out for a walk shortly after. Meanwhile, an argument broke out between Hall and Cataldi. The two men physically fought, but their brawl turned into a murder. Hall used the weapon Pender had purchased for him to kill both Andrew Cataldi and his partner, Tricia Nordman. Both of them were dead by the time Sarah Pender returned from her walk. Pender didn't recoil in horror. She didn't call the police. Instead, she helped her boyfriend place the bodies in the back of Hall's truck. The two of them drove away and placed the bodies in a dumpster. Hall was arrested in Noblesville on October 27th, and he confessed to the murders straight away. Pender was arrested the same day. Pender herself faced trial at Marion Superior Court in July 2002, but neither Pender nor Hall testified at the trial. The trial was ruthless, and despite the fact that no DNA evidence was found that linked Pender to the murders, the prosecution was hell-bent on proving her guilt. She was dubbed a master manipulator. The court heard that even though Richard Hall was the one who pulled the trigger, Pender pulled the strings. Larry Sells, the prosecuting attorney, called Sarah Pender the female Charles Manson, claiming her influence over Hall was akin to Manson's influence over his cult. Hall pleaded guilty to avoid trial. He claimed from the start that the murders had been Pender's idea, which further convinced the court. Despite this, Hall never backed his claim, never gave any indication as to why Pender would have wanted Cataldi and Nordman dead, but Hall claimed Pender had admitted her guilt in a letter she'd sent him in May 2001. Sarah Pender was found guilty and sentenced to 110 years in prison on August 22, 2002. And now, 6 years later, on August 4, 2008, she was ready to leave. Efforts to get her out of jail legally had always failed. It hadn't even mattered that Richard Hall himself, in a signed affidavit, had recanted and admitted the letter was a forgery. So Pender used all her resources to get herself out of jail and back to freedom. Rockville Correctional Facility, Indiana's largest state prison for women, was a medium security prison. But Sarah Jo Pender's escape plan didn't involve intricate machinations anyways. It involved feelings and money. On the morning of August 4, 2008, Pender sat in her cell, patiently waiting for the plan to unfold. Once she was out of her cell, she went to the prison's gymnasium. A change of clothes awaited her, provided by her accomplice, Scott Spittler. Scott Spittler had been a corrections officer at Rockville Correctional Facility for 5 years. He had a wife and kids, but he also had an ongoing sexual relationship with Sarah Pender, whom he thought was an intelligent, sexy woman. Once Pender let him know about her desire to break out of jail, Spittler agreed to help her. But this decision wasn't made entirely out of love. Pender promised him $15,000 if he helped her escape. Spittler just couldn't refuse the money. After Pender changed into civilian clothes, she proceeded to walk to the fueling area. Spittler was there, waiting for her in a van. Pender got into the van and hid under one of the seats. Spittler drove toward the prison gate, knowing surely that the van wouldn't be searched. Spittler drove Pender to one of the facility's parking lots. It was time for the second part of the plan. Jamie Long was waiting for Sarah Jo Pender in a car. Long and Pender had met in 2007 while inmates at the Marion County Jail. The two women formed a close, intimate relationship, with Long even calling Pender her wife. After being released from prison, Long would keep visiting Sarah Pender. It was during one of these visits that the older woman had agreed to help Pender escape. Pender got into Long's car. Relief hit her. She was free and almost safe. Long drove Pender to Indianapolis and gave her $140 before wishing her good luck and dropping her off. Now on her own, Sarah Jo Pender fled Indiana, hoping to find her new beginning somewhere else. Meanwhile, an inmate count revealed that Pender was missing. Authorities acted swiftly, and the prison was immediately put on maximum security lockdown. Surveillance tapes and the guard shack log revealed that Pender had been aided by Spittler, who was arrested the day after the escape on August 5th. Once arrested, Spittler didn't hold back and told investigators about Jamie Long's part in Pender's escape. Long was arrested 2 days later on August 7th. Pender moved to Chicago and managed to get a job as an estimator for a contractor. She used a fake name, Ashley Thompson, and settled as a good, law-abiding citizen in a North Side Chicago neighborhood. Authorities didn't cease their efforts to recapture her. TV show America's Most Wanted ran a feature on Pender in September 2008, a month after her escape. Pender was added to the U.S. Marshals 15 Most Wanted Fugitives list a month later, in October 2008. And perhaps her dream of freedom would have succeeded if not for a rerun of America's Most Wanted in December 2008. After seeing the rerun, one of Pender's, now Thompson's, new neighbors identified her as a fugitive and alerted the Chicago police. And just like that, Pender's apartment was surrounded by the police. The woman didn't resist arrest, but she denied she was Sarah Pender. After her escape, Pender was held in solitary confinement for 5 years. She was allowed to leave her cell for only 2 hours a day. She spent the rest of her time by herself, reading and trying to keep her mental sanity. She was transferred back to Rockville Correctional Facility in 2018. Sarah Pender's story is a controversial one, with many people believing her being convicted for murder is nothing else but a glaring system failure. More shockingly, Larry Sells, the prosecuting attorney who linked her to Charles Manson and worked to see her behind bars for 110 years, now believes Sarah Jo Pender to be innocent. Pender is now 43 years old. According to Larry Sells, justice is long overdue for Sarah Pender. Unfortunately, the legal system has to date failed her, but that grievous error can and should be corrected. Pender has spent most of her time in prison trying to appeal the verdict, and perhaps she will never stop. It was January 1995, a new year with new goals. But while many people dreamt of getting a higher paycheck or losing a bit of weight in the new year, these 3 men dreamt of escaping. Freedom was just outside, on the other side of the bars. Andrew Roger, Keith Rose, and Matthew Williams met in prison. All of them were serving life sentences. 2 of them were, simply put, murderers. Andrew Roger was jailed for killing a swimming pool attendant with a crowbar back in 1987. Keith Rose was jailed in 1991 for the brutal murder of a woman. Matthew Williams was in prison for several crimes, including arson and bomb making. The 3 men became friends, and together they hatched a plan to escape prison once and for all. In 1995, Parkhurst was a chaotic place, the perfect breeding ground for crime. There were a number of reasons for this dramatic downfall of the prison. One of them was the continual building work at the jail, which started in 1988 and was supposed to have been finished in 1993. The building work gave a sense of instability and agitation to both the inmates and the prison guards. And the hierarchy was off. Prisoners controlled their daily existence with no objection from the guards. This made bullying and intimidation run rampant. Drugs and gambling were a normal daily occurrence, and many prisoners had, believe it or not, what one would call a steady income. The governor spent only 2 or 3 hours a week talking to the prison staff, much less than the 50 hours legally imposed. This meant prison staff had nobody who could realistically listen to their concerns. There was nobody who could ask them about their needs, about the security issues, about the state of the building, or the mental state of the prisoners. There was nobody to care that at some point the prison had been taken over by the convicts. Even more, the staff was largely untrained and the security technology was lacking. A sense of leniency was ruling over the prison. The day of the escape finally came. After months of planning and working toward their freedom, Roger, Rose, and Williams could almost feel it. It was the 3rd of January 1995. New year, new them, preferably far away from Parkhurst and the Isle of Wight. It was a normal day. None of the 3 men wanted to draw attention to their little group. The more unnoticed they were, the better. They'd worked way too hard to have their plan crumble because of a nosy guard. And then evening came, and it was finally time to break out of that damned place. Parkhurst was maybe the perfect place for an escape, if only one had enough courage. And Roger, Rose, and Williams had courage and skill aplenty. Once the idea of escape had taken root in their minds, all 3 men had started working toward their nefarious goal. Nobody had even flinched an eye once the group had started spending most of their time in the prison's metal shop. Perhaps it may have escaped everyone's mind that one of the 3 men was a qualified sheet metal worker. The guards would often leave the 3 prisoners to their own devices. They worked in the metal shop unsupervised, free to create their own little props for the escape. Night fell over the Isle of Wight. The prisoners at Parkhurst were allowed to exercise in the prison's small gym every day. But on that evening, Roger, Rose, and Williams stayed in the gym after exercise. They went unnoticed, despite the fact that the guards had seen 10 people going into the gym in the first place, but only 7 of them returned to their cells. With some 200 pounds between the 3 of them, the men set off toward freedom. Together they walked about 600 feet without being seen. using their precious key to open doors. Everything was going according to plan. The men then went down to the prison workshop to get the rest of their tools. Roger, Rose, and Williams were incredibly crafty. They'd managed to make a huge ladder out of some goalposts. Nobody noticed. They'd managed to make a key, one that would help them see through their plan. It was a perfect copy of a prison officer's key made only from memory. Nobody noticed. They'd even managed to make a gun and acquire blank ammo. Once again, you guessed it, nobody noticed. Or maybe nobody wanted to notice. In reality, officers knew prisoners would often take advantage of the general noise and chaos to acquire illicit items through visitors. Even more, there was already a growing suspicion that some of the officers would bring illegal items in the prison themselves. Once they had the 3-section ladder, the men made their way toward the 25-foot-high perimeter wall. Before scaling the wall, they had to cut their way through a mesh fence. Once again, they went unnoticed. Guards were supposed to watch the television screens and monitor the perimeter, but they were either untrained or distracted by other duties. And there were no alarms on the perimeter fence, despite 20 years worth of complaints demanding this additional safety measure. To top it off, some areas weren't even covered by the closed-circuit cameras. The prison played a major role in the group's escape. They simply couldn't have done it without its precious aid. Their plan might have been harder to accomplish in any other place, but in 1995, HM Prison Parkhurst was just a pale shadow of its former self. The place has a long history, one that started in 1778, when Parkhurst was a military hospital and a children's asylum. 60 years later, it turned into a prison for children. Its reputation was not a great one. Parkhurst was one of the toughest jails in the British Isles, and many criticized the institution for its harsh regime, especially since its convicts were mostly teenage boys. In 1966, Parkhurst became a top security prison, an austere place which inspired fear, but it was downgraded in the 90s, and as you can see, for good reason. After scaling the wall, the men were out of the prison, at last free. But they had to move quickly. Once they got out, Roger, Rose, and Williams walked to Newport, the county town of the Isle of Wight, while wearing their own clothes, which we can assume the men had acquired during their careful preparation for their escape. Once they got to Newport, the three of them took a taxi 9 miles to Sandown. Their plan wasn't over. What good was their prison escape if they didn't manage to get off the Isle of Wight? There's only so much room to hide on a small piece of land in the English Channel. No. They had to get to a small, private airport between Sandown and Shankill in the east of the island and steal a plane. Keith Rose was going to be their amateur pilot. Fleeing by water was too much of a risk. No, they had to fly. Once they got to the airport, they only found a small Cessna 105, locked away in the main hangar. Rose was sure they could make it work, despite the fact that the Cessna 105 is a trainer aircraft meant for 2 people, not for the 3 heavy men. Perhaps they had no idea that the aircraft would have no chance of leaving the runway with all 3 of them inside. They used a crowbar to open it. Once they got inside, they were met with another problem. There was no cockpit key either. Rose used a piece of crude metal to try and get the engine going. The man struggled for a while, but it soon became obvious that his efforts were futile. And then, to make matters even worse, the piece of metal broke off. Half of it was now stuck in the lock. What now? Well, they had to hide. Surely they had hundreds of officers on their tail by now. In reality, nobody at the prison noticed their absence for 2 hours. It was a dog handler at Parkhurst who first noticed a hole in the wire perimeter fence. After that, it took an additional 30 minutes for officers to figure out who was missing. And while officers knew they had to start the hunt for the 3 prisoners, they had no idea how to go about it. Who should be called for help? Roger, Rose, and Williams hid in the small woods that littered the area. There were a number of abandoned farm buildings, each of them a perfect hiding place. The group managed to stay hidden for 5 nights. By the 5th night of their escape, the whole island was plastered with posters of their faces. They were cold and hungry and more than desperate. It was Sunday, January 8th, 1995, when their luck turned from bad to worse. At about 7:20 p.m., the 3 men were walking along a road in plain view. That's when they were spotted by Colin Jones, an off-duty officer, who immediately flagged down a passing police motorcyclist. 10 minutes later, Roger and Rose were apprehended, but Matthew Williams had somehow managed to escape and flee the authorities. Williams was cornered 2 hours later and was immediately taken back to Parkhurst. 2 of the men lost heart and gave up running just after a short distance across the field. Rose and Roger looked dejected. They didn't have any strength left in them, but Williams looked much fitter. He was desperate to get away and disappeared off across the fields, a police officer later told the press. It was May 12, 2022, and a Texas Department of Criminal Justice bus was making its way from the Alfred D. Hugh unit in Gatesville, Texas, toward a medical appointment in Huntsville. The ride was going to be 3 hours long. The morning was serene as it could be for 16 prisoners and 2 veteran prison officers, one which was driving the bus, all sharing the same enclosed space. Then, one of the men, a heavily tattooed Mexican prisoner named Gonzalo Lopez, started talking. His words were addressed to Michael Wages, the inmate behind Lopez. His words were bold, and in retrospect, taunting. But only a few minutes later, Lopez's intentions became somewhat clearer, at least to Wages, who was the only one really paying attention to the man. As for the guards, they were either lost in conversation or too uninterested to notice. But it happened all the same. With a few concealed and quick movements, Gonzalo Lopez slipped out of his handcuffs. Then he removed his leg irons. His movements were natural and carefree. He had planned this for a long while. The man had spent the last couple of months, weeks, and days fashioning or somehow acquiring a key. He'd known that, when the time came, he would use this key to discard his handcuffs. And on the morning of May 12, 2022, just before he was taken on the bus, he made sure to slip the key inside his mouth. A few minutes after freeing himself from the handcuffs and leg irons, Lopez produced 2 8 to 10 inch metal weapons from his pockets. Michael Wages, who was sitting right behind Gonzalo Lopez, was the only one to notice the blades. He was terrified, but what scared him more was the look in Lopez's eyes. Wages knew straight away the man was a killer, and that Lopez wouldn't let anything or anyone destroy whatever plan he'd hatched. Despite this, Lopez gave him a quick reassurance that he wasn't going to kill him. Still terrified and fearing for his life, Wages chose to keep his mouth shut and not alert the prison officers. Wages' assessment was, in fact, correct. Gonzalo Lopez was a killer with a long history of violence. His criminal history dates back to 1994, when an 18-year-old Lopez was convicted of aggravated assault, possession of marijuana, failure to stop and render aid, and unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. In 1996, he was sentenced to 8 years in prison for all these charges. In 2004, the man was involved in a high-speed police chase. After firing shots at the police, Lopez escaped by fleeing on foot. But his most gruesome crime yet, the one he was currently in prison for, was the 2005 kidnapping and murder of Jose Guadalupe Ramirez. In 2005, Gonzalo Lopez was part of the La Mana drug cartel based in Tamaulipas, Mexico. Ramirez owed the cartel $40,000, and he had to pay it back one way or another. Lopez killed Ramirez with a pickaxe before burying his body in the woods. Lopez was arrested a month later, in April 2005, and he was sentenced to life in prison for capital murder and aggravated kidnapping. Gonzalo Lopez wasn't someone to be messed with. He was as resourceful as he was gruesome. In the months before May 12, 2022, the man went on many medical trips, not because he had any serious health issues, but because he wanted to get familiar with the prison buses and the security protocols. These trips helped him make some important discoveries. First, the number of guards present on these trips was way smaller than expected. Almost half of the prison guard jobs at the Hughes unit were vacant. Because of this, the remaining guards were overworked, which made them grow increasingly lax. Lopez had noticed this laxity and used it to his advantage. That's how he knew making a key for the handcuffs and obtaining the blades would be safe. He knew the guards wouldn't bother to use the body orifice security scanner, or boss chair, on him. If the guards had used the device, they would have surely noticed the metallic pieces hidden in Lopez's mouth. But they failed to do so. They didn't even give him a quick pat-down. After he freed himself, Gonzalo Lopez opened all of the windows he could reach inside the caged area at the front of the bus, which was reserved for high-security prisoners. Then, over the next hour, Lopez started prying up the tack welds around the square of the metal grating between the high-security prisoners and the driver. Had there been a third officer inside the bus, Lopez might have been spotted and stopped, but as such, he was free to do as he pleased. It certainly helped that the other prisoners were rooting for him. Once they realized what the man was doing, 2 of them started rapping rather loudly. They wanted to help him. It was around midday and the bus was now approaching the tiny town of Centerville, located halfway between Houston and Dallas. An hour and a half into the trip, Gonzalo Lopez managed to pry off a 9-inch by 18-inch square of grating. The escape was on. In an instant, Lopez stabbed the driver with one of the shanks. The bus came to an abrupt stop on Highway 7, and the two men stumbled outside fighting. But Lopez had the upper hand. He managed to snatch the driver's gun holster, but he didn't have time to figure out how to remove the weapon. Suddenly, the other officer burst out of the bus, gun in hand. The driver begged him to shoot Lopez, but Lopez was quicker. With both officers now outside, Lopez scrambled back up into the bus and began driving away. The officers started shooting, but they couldn't hit Lopez. Instead, they managed to hit one of the rear tires. Still, Lopez drove away a couple of miles down Highway 7 near Centerville. Then he crashed the bus into a ditch, but he wasn't about to get caught. Instead, he dove out of a window and took off, leaving the other prisoners fearing for their lives. A nearby police officer in a patrol car was alerted by an onlooker. But even though he was the first on the scene when the bus crashed, he saw Lopez running away. The officer failed to chase after the inmate or shoot at him. For more than an hour after Lopez got free, the guards couldn't figure out who had escaped. They thought it had been Wages, but as we know, Wages was still on the bus. As soon as Lopez was identified as the escapee, the manhunt was on. The Lone Star Fugitive Task Force, the Texas Rangers, and the U.S. Marshals all showed up to aid in the search. But hundreds of people, helicopters fitted with thermal imaging, and tracking dogs weren't enough to find the man. For 3 weeks, nobody had any idea where Lopez was. Well, at least not officially. By late May, authorities and locals alike were more or less convinced Gonzalo Lopez had already fled the area, and that searching for him was futile. But on May 31st, authorities got an interesting call about a breaking and entering on Highway 7 in Centerville. They discovered evidence that Lopez was to blame. The thief had stolen food, soda, a jacket, and bottled water in addition to taking a shower with rainwater. Investigators examined a nearby vacation property owned by one Collins family after gathering forensic evidence to compare with the DNA of the escapee. Yet nobody informed the people that Gonzalo Lopez might still be nearby. As such, people relaxed. They thought they were safe. They thought the monster was gone. He was only getting ready to strike in a bloody, grotesque, and inhuman manner. On June 2, 2022, Gonzalo Lopez broke into a ranch owned by the Collins family in Centerville, Texas. Inside, he found 66-year-old Mark Collins and his 4 grandchildren. 8-year-old Waylon Collins, 16-year-old Carson Collins, and 11-year-old Hudson Collins. 11-year-old Bryson Collins was their cousin. Gonzalo Lopez killed them all, either by shooting or by stabbing them. After murdering the 5 members of the Collins family, Lopez stole several guns from the ranch, including an AR-15. Then he took off in the family's white pickup. The Leon County Sheriff's Office discovered that Lopez's DNA matched the burglary's DNA on June 2nd, only 2 days later. 20 minutes later, the Sheriff's Office fielded a call from Chris Collins, who said he was worried about his 3 sons and their cousin. Law enforcement officers headed to the Collins ranch. They found the bodies inside. The white pickup had been seen heading south from San Antonio. Spike strips were laid across the highway. Lopez drove over, puncturing all his tires, but he didn't stop driving. Once he entered the city limits of Jordanton, Lopez shot at the police through the truck's window. Then he lost control of the truck, crashed into a utility pole, and finally crashed into a fence. But the fight hadn't left him. He got out of the truck and started shooting at officers. He was killed in the shootout. 7 months after Gonzalo Lopez, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice released a report showing the multiple failures that led to Lopez's escape. The report concluded the escape could have been prevented. Maybe then, Mark Collins and his 4 grandchildren would still be alive.